welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I'm Jessica. I am your host, and I am here with the author of a really good book that it's like one of those books that I read it very quickly, but I had to think about it for longer than I read it. Like it was one of those two sittings books, which is difficult because I have an active job and an active family. But I really was very much drawn into the story from the beginning. And then I've spent the last 2 days just thinking about it and kind of mulling it over in my head. So I would love you to introduce yourself and tell us about Everybody Says It's Everything.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for just having me on the show and for reading the book. I know it's hard to read books. It's part of my job too. And, it's still the thing that seems to happen the latest at night when I'm the most tired. It's hard. Well, I am from Connecticut originally, and all of my work thus far has been set in Connecticut. So I'm definitely a tri-state girly. My first book was a short story collection called Domesticated Wild Things. My first novel was called Brass, and then this is my new novel, Everybody Says It's Everything. I would say that essentially Everybody Says It's Everything is the story of Albanian-born, American-raised twins who diverge greatly in adulthood, and it's about the kind of schism and work that they are trying to do to come back together to kind of prove themselves as individuals and kind of figure out questions about their identity.
So, as a mother of twins, that's one of the reasons I immediately saw the blurb for the book and I was like, oh, yes, we absolutely have to do this one. I absolutely have to do this one because I find it a very interesting situation raising two people who have the same birthday and you raise them with the same things at the same time. And now that they're about to turn 10, they're really starting to, they're differing a lot, but they're still very close. But they are their own people.
Mhm.
Other thing that grabbed me about it was that it was set in 1999, which is nostalgic because I remember all of the hype around Y2K, and that was when people still used not as much, but really still used dial-up.
Mm.
And it wasn't like it was more predominant. I mean, my house didn't get what we call the internet until the early aughts,
Mhm.
my parents' house. But like there was a lot there, and I remember a lot of that time. So I was like, this is definitely something I want to read. And I read it, and it just was such an interesting story about people trying to figure themselves out and trying to figure their family out. And that in and of itself is like the human experience for a lot of people in this country, I think.
Mhm.
So I'm very curious where the story came from for you, like where Pete or Patrice and Drita, who are our protagonists, came from, but also just the characters that surround them, like their parents and Dakota and his mother, because they are as much part of this whole tapestry of family as our central twins.
Yeah, so the setting, the temporal setting anyway, 1999 was kind of fortuitous because, I'm Albanian myself. I am not from Kosovo. My family is not from Kosovo, but I got to know a number of Kosovo Albanians who came to Waterbury, where I grew up, in 1998 and 1999 during the war in Kosovo. And so I was always intrigued by that story, but I also felt like it wasn't my story to tell as somebody who is kind of born and raised in Connecticut, even though I have Albanian family. And so when I wanted to approach the story, I was like, I want the characters to be kind of somewhat outside of the story. And that's how I decided on Drita and Pete, who are both kind of trying to figure out where their Albanian identity kind of comes into their everyday lives, because they've been kind of estranged from it because they were adopted and raised by an Italian American family in Connecticut. So it was just kind of based around the fact of the war that the book was set in 1999. But like you, I have a real nostalgia for that time. It was, my teenagehood took place in the 1990s, and I also wanted to kind of like go back and explore a little bit of the early Wild West of the internet. So this is kind of before Google, you have a character like Drita who's using AOL to basically what we now call Google stalk her brother. She figures out where he's been up to because she discovers his footprint online. I was like, that was the Wild West of those, like that wasn't a thing that we were all doing at that point. Like you, I didn't have AOL, and I didn't have internet in the house until a little bit later. So it was really fun for me to go back and kind of look at some of the internet archive and some of the screenshots from that time, and then go back and with my 2025 perspective, look at the heyday of the burgeoning kind of internet era when we were first kind of using the internet to start to form our identities and connect with other humans outside of our immediate range. And so it was really fun to get Drita in particular to kind of like begin this relationship with somebody online, strictly through email. And she's kind of hunting down her brother, but unintentionally developing feelings for this person. So that was all really great. In terms of the other characters around them, the book is set in Waterbury, Connecticut, which is where I was born and raised, and it's a very diverse place. But I would say that Italian Americans kind of were the dominant culture in Waterbury, to the point where when I left Waterbury, I thought that Italian Americans ruled the world, and they were in all the highest offices in the nation because they were in all of the offices in City Hall, and all of our restaurants were Italian. And so when I understood that these characters were going to be adopted, it just made sense to me that they were going to be raised by an Italian American family, because that was, it just made up so much of the culture of where I was from.
I really enjoyed the exploration of the early internet too, because I got this weird just memory when, Drita is in the chat rooms, the AOL chat rooms, and somebody says ASL, and she's like, American Sign Language, no age, sex, location. And I'm like, oh, I forgot that that was a thing
See, and I
that
didn't
people
even.
used, that was like a thing people used to ask. And I remember when I first saw LOL,
uh
my friend and I were sitting there and we're like, what does that mean? And I theorized it meant loser online. No, I was like, okay. But now people just use LOL and everybody knows what that means. But that was just a real fun trip down memory lane to take with her.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned the ASL. So like I said, I was not really an online chatter, even though I was kind of prime age for it. But again, we didn't have the computer in the house. So I had to do research on that. And so when I was looking back on like, what were the early internet exchanges like? Where did people meet? What was the lingo? Some of it has stuck around, like you said, like LOL. We all know what that means, but nobody goes online anymore to ask for ASL. And so I just tried to like approach it from a person who's completely new to this, because in a way I was new to AOL myself, and be completely baffled and bewildered by it, but at the same time also be like intrigued by the possibility that suddenly there's a whole world that you have access to, like through your computer screen. And that was brand new in the 90s. And I think we take it for granted now, but it was a really confusing and bewildering but exciting time, to kind of be young and expand your horizons through this little portal on your desktop. So yeah, it was really fun to go back and kind of put myself, use this character Drita as an avatar of how I might have done things in the 90s, even though in real life that's not how I how I engage with the internet.
I also just thought the back and forth was very interesting, how you went through the different time periods, the 80s, and then, when Jackie and Dom were kids, Jackie and Dom being Drita and Pete's parents, and then also just between Drita and Pete themselves, where you can sort of see where they're both at the moment. Was it
Mhm.
hard for you to keep the timelines separate, but also like the characters' voices? Because I felt like they all came through as very authentic when I was reading about them. But I would imagine it might have been tough as a reader. Like, did you ever get someone's voice stuck in your head when you were supposed to be writing a chapter about somebody else or, the time period?
You know, actually, not really. I have to say, I think that there is this just psychological switch that happens when I'm like, okay, I'm Drita right now. I'm Drita today. I'm Drita this week. And I really let myself get situated there and kind of use the language. Okay, this is somebody who did go to college and she's young, she's lonely. I identify with those things. But she is going to be a little bit more kind of reserved in her language than Pete, who is gruffer, who didn't go to college. And so kind of switching back and forth between their languages and vernaculars. I had to fit once I figured out their characters and kind of what their voices were, switching back and forth between them wasn't very difficult. With Jackie, where we're now going back in time also to when she and Dom are first married back in the early 70s. That was a kind of accidental detour that the project took because I intended Jackie to be a pretty minor character. And when I was putting her on the page, because I hadn't really considered her very much, she was just coming across as very flat. Kind of just this shrill, annoying mother character. And I was like, this is not going to be pleasant to read. So I just did a little bit of what I like to call playing in the sandbox. So I'll have a document where I just do some exploring about characters or about a scene that I don't necessarily intend to put directly back into the manuscript, but I just wanted to figure out her character more. And that's when I started kind of writing her history. And that's when I kind of accidentally discovered how important her history was going to be to the twins and the story that she has kind of created around them, and their siblinghood and their kind of history. So that was really fun for me because it was not something that I had originally in the outline, and it was just a way for me to kind of make a 3D rendering of what I intended to be a minor character, and then she becomes a pretty important one.
When it comes to the war itself, I remember being in school and hearing about it. And we, had a few Albanian families in my school, and we'd hear about it. The efforts that Pete goes through to kind of connect with his heritage through that and finding his people. Did you have to, was that like a thing that really happened? I don't want to give it away
Mhm.
because I was like, oh, okay, but I'm curious, if like now that because we hear stories about people connecting with other cultures and or finding out more about their own culture and sort of jumping in like through internet things, but back then that really would have been the first time someone could be like, well, I was raised here in a completely different culture. I want to know more about this and connect through the internet. Did you do any research about that?
Yeah, I did a fair amount of research. I actually had a couple of pretty academic texts that were about kind of like the Balkan exiles and kind of Balkan immigration patterns and things like that, especially during the Kosovo War. That being said, I am Albanian, and what I understood innately and inherently without having to do research is that Albanian identity is very, very strong. And that because of communism in the 20th century, the number of Albanians who lived outside of Albania was something like 90%. So it was a huge population that was Albanian, did not live in Albania, lived in Europe, lived in the United States, lived all throughout North and South America. And so there is this remarkable ability for Albanians to retain a strong identity no matter where they are in the world. And so I already knew about that. What I didn't necessarily know about specifically was an organized group of expatriate Albanians who were responsible for funding and generating a lot of publicity for the war in Kosovo. And that was something that actually did happen. And it was centered in New York. But I mean, Albanians from all around the world contributed to the effort, which I find that very fascinating, and have always been aware of the strong Albanian identity, but I wasn't really aware so much of the actual distinctive organizing that took place for the Kosovo War until I did some research on it.
I just loved all of the connections, and the dialogue was gorgeous in this book. It was just really so nice. It was so refreshing to read, and I felt so much for all the characters, even the ones that were a bit of a hot mess.
I love a hot mess character. That's my specialty.
Um, yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because as I was reading the book, like when I first heard about the book and it's everybody says everything, I'm like, oh, okay, but then like as I was reading it, I'm like, oh, okay, now I get the title. It's family, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
It's funny. I just did another interview where somebody asked me specifically about the title and had a really hard time coming up with a title for this book. It's not one of my great talents in general, is titling projects. But Everybody Says It's Everything is a line directly from the book, and it is a piece of dialogue, as you mentioned. And it is clear when you encounter that in the book that it's referring to family specifically. But before you've read the book, you're not really sure what that means. Everybody says it's everything. Like, who is everybody? What is everything? And so I kind of like the ambiguity of that. But then it becomes more specifically this question about family as you're reading the book. And, one of the things that I wanted to explore in the book too was like, what exactly is family? Because in the case of Pete and Drita, they're adopted. They have a kind of family that is not related by blood. You figure out through reading I don't want to spoil anything, but there are complications in their own sibling relationship that they weren't aware of. And that's something that just personally I find very fascinating because I also come from a blended family and I have biological siblings. I have half siblings, step siblings, and it's a very kind of American story, I think, of we all come from these different places, and yet somehow we're put together and made to live in the same house. And as you mentioned having 10-year-old twins. My mother is a twin. She has a twin brother. They're very different. I grew up with five siblings who were biological or step, but we all lived in the same house. And it's astounding to me how people who were raised under the same conditions by the same humans could turn out so differently. And who knows if it's a nature or nurture question, because I'm as different from my biological siblings as I am from my step siblings, and also same in many ways. So I wanted to kind of really explore this question of how we kind of how we define family, whether your loyalties are going to be inherently based in blood or if it's a kind of connection that is kind of earned through respect and through learning and understanding.
Thank you so much. This was a beautiful book. Check it out at your library, at your favorite bookstore. I think this is definitely one that book clubs are going to really like.
I hope so. Yeah. And thanks so much for representing it as a librarian. I think I might have mentioned at the beginning of the show, I also have a library science degree and I worked as a librarian. I have
Excellent.
Great love for the libraries. I think they're the best places on earth. So I appreciate you stalking for keeping the book in the library and spreading the word.
Thank you so much. So before we go, are you working on anything for the future?
Yes, it's early days still. So I want to say I can't get too into it, not just because I don't want to curse anything, but also because I'm still figuring it out as I'm writing. But I will say it's a pretty big departure from what I've worked on before in that it includes the supernatural. So I have never worked in a speculative mode before. This is new to me, but I'm having a lot of fun with it. So I'm excited to get back to it.
All right. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest was
Xenet Aliu.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.